The Sony a7 III completely revolutionized the camera industry. I think in a lot of ways it was the camera that started the beginning of the end of the age of the DSLR, the primary camera design for the previous 2 decades. It packed a spec sheet that was unheard of in the past, a full-frame 24 megapixel sensor, which was sharp, great in low light, and stabilized. It captured downsampled 4K from the entire sensor, shot 10 frames per second in stills, had 1080 120 frames per second, impressive dynamic range in stills and in video, amazing autofocus from the Sony a9 in stills and in video, all for $2,000, a true hybrid beast. I think the best way to put this into perspective is to remember that just a year earlier, the Canon 6D Mark II was released with its notorious 26 megapixel sensor that had truly awful dynamic range. 1080p video, no IBIS. I mean, the Sony a7 III was announced. It was no contest which camera was better. Which camera was setting the bar for the future. And the DSLRs were stuck in the past. However, today I want to talk about the successor to the legendary a7 III. I want to talk about a camera that I have been using off and on for the past year and a half. A camera that has been overshadowed by its older brother. However, together, me and this uninspiring camera have shot some of my favorite professional and passion projects. It's been at my side through weddings, captured some of my favorite landscapes, and been present as our business went from a side project to my full-time job. This is my experience with the Sony a7 IV.
We are now recording this for the second time because I didn't have audio on. But we are up here, about to climb Mount Sherman. It's about 5 miles all the way up to the summit. So
it's about 5 a.m.
It's 5
miles up and back.
And back again. It's 2.5 miles to the summit.
Easy.
So this is a candidate in my mind for the best first 14er, potentially.
I feel like the reviews that are out there on this camera are completely preoccupied with test charts and stops of dynamic range and completely lost inside the camera, either justifying why they purchased it or just reading off the spec sheet and saying, well, it's a camera that could be used to make amazing things but could also be a waste of money compared to a billion other cameras. This is what I want to avoid doing. I want to give you guys a different kind of review. Instead of reviewing the specs, I want to be reviewing my use of the camera, the footage and the images I got with it, and how this camera helped or hurt my creative journey. I think the first place to start is discussing the handling and the build of the camera, how I used it, and how it's held up. I do want to be very clear and upfront that this is not going to be a full tour of the camera. That's going to be for another video. More information about that at the end of this one. Instead, I'm just going to be giving you guys an overview of features on this body that I love and some of the features of the design of the camera that I don't love. And the first thing that I want to start off with is the biggest pro I can think of on this camera, and that is the addition of this dial here, the photo video switch dial. Now, the photo video switch dial is nothing new to cameras as a whole, but it was brand new to Sony cameras. Sony had never had this, and as a heavy user of the Sony a7 III and an even heavier user of the Sony a7S III, this little tweak to the body design is absolutely massive and makes using the camera so much easier. Moving onward with that hybrid shooting that I absolutely found amazing about this camera, I want to talk about this change here, this dial. Now, it may not look like a big deal,
But changing this dial from the mandatory exposure compensation dial over to just another custom dial leads to a couple of really cool things you can do with this. Now, first of all, you can set and forget, quite literally lock this dial up, which it has that awesome lock function, and forget that it exists and use this camera like any other Sony camera you've ever used. But I recommend using this dial. And the reason why is because when you're using this camera in a hybrid sense, both stills and video, you run into this problem of when you're shooting video, wanting to leave your shutter speed in the exact same place that you've always had it. And for me, the way I have the camera set up, I actually change my shutter speed and frame rate with the PASM dial custom modes on the top, essentially meaning that to follow the 180-degree shutter rule, when shooting video, when in the video mode, as you can see here, I never have to touch the shutter speed. I'm instead going to be using auto ISO and a variable ND filter on the front of the camera, other ways of setting exposure. However, when I switch over to shooting stills, all of a sudden the shutter speed goes from the thing I don't want to change to the thing I want to change the most often. So having that, not in an ideal position or for stills is also annoying. So in video mode, I'm able to lock this dial and maintain that lockage and not be able to accidentally bump my shutter speed. Whereas in stills, all I have to do is unlock that. Without changing the layout of my exposure dials, I have then essentially unlocked the ability to quickly change my shutter speed. This may seem like a really small detail, but for me, it has made the camera a lot more reliable and exposing for both stills and video a lot simpler, and switching back and forth between them a lot simpler as well. One of the things that I do not love about this camera is something shared by all Sony bodies, and that is this here, the grip. Now, looking at the grip, you may notice something interesting. The shutter button actually comes down off the grip. So this is the top of the camera, and the shutter button is actually on a lower platform that slants downwards. Now, of course, the shutter button is slanted the opposite direction to make it a little easier to push. But the reason why I really want to point this particular thing out to you is this camera just isn't as comfortable to hold as most other cameras I've used. For example, the Canon R5 feels better in the hand. The Nikon Z6, 7 series, and the Z8 series all feel better in the hand because they give your fingers a little bit of extra room on the grip. As you can see, my middle finger on this hand and this finger and my pinky are really squished together in order to stay on the camera. Whereas on most other brands, where the shutter button, I don't know what you'd call this little grip area, is actually lifted above the rest of the camera. Another great example of this is the Panasonic a7IV 2X, the camera that I'm shooting on right now, which has that raised area on the grip. This does not increase the height of the camera because it would still be lower than the viewfinder, so it doesn't affect its ease on storing in bags. I honestly have no clue why Sony has it designed this way. Now, I do appreciate the fact that this back dial has been popped off the back of the body. However, the front dial is still a little difficult to turn when you are wearing gloves. Now, not a huge deal again, but this is one of those areas where a lot of other camera brands have solved this problem in other ways to make all the dials really easy to turn, whether you're wearing gloves to survive negative 10 degree Fahrenheit temperatures or not. Now, another area on this camera that I'm not a huge fan of is going to be this whole side of the camera. Now, Sony's bodies are designed to be used one-handed almost exclusively with your right hand. And this little choice on Sony's part, I don't think is necessarily bad, but it does lead to some wasted space on the camera. For example, there are no custom buttons between the mount and the grip on the front of the camera. This is just open space, and there's also no space on this part of the camera either. This is just literally nothing, not even a cool design or something. There's nothing there, and most cameras utilize that space. And we know Sony thinks about this side of the camera because on the Sony A1 series, they have a cool frame or drive mode setting dial there. Now here's the problem. It's cool that that's on the premium model, but I personally think it would be awesome if that was on all cameras, and they found some other cool thing to give the premium model besides just essentially the same handling as the Sony a7IV, with an extra dial where you should have one anyway. The last thing that I think is good about this camera, but also not the best, is going to be this flip out screen. Now, this flip out screen is not the absolute best I've ever seen in my life, and we have actually damaged this screen here at Summit Bid. As you can see here, it's cracked, and you know, it's a fine screen. I feel like judging focus is a little tricky with both the back screen and the viewfinder. I think they both leave a little to be desired, just as a whole. A couple other big things with the physical body on this camera is going to be battery life. So battery life on this camera is incredible. I love these Z batteries that Sony has. The battery life is impeccable. Oftentimes I can shoot an entire day on one battery, especially when it's one of my more passion projects, like capturing or documenting a hike. I feel like I can shoot all the 4K I want with just a few batteries in my bag. I usually keep 2 extra batteries in my bag when I go on a shoot. I have a couple extras as well that I would take on a professional shoot, like a wedding or something, but the ability to just trust that I have all the time lapses, photos, and video I need on realistically 2 batteries for a full day of shooting is a huge relief, and something that I personally really appreciate about this camera. Another awesome thing about this camera is going to be the dual SD card slots, as you can see on the back here. This is just a huge perk about this camera. Now, most of the competition these days also have dual card slots, so it really isn't that impressive, but I do enjoy that. Another huge thing I love about this camera is this full-sized HDMI port on the side here. That was a big improvement from Sony's older a7 III that just was really difficult to use. I will say though that that is the other thing that has actually failed on this camera is this HDMI port. It still works when I use my Ninja V, which I actually do fairly frequently with this camera. However, I find that the signal cuts out fairly frequently, and after testing the cord with other cameras, they do not have the same issues. So if I'm being completely honest with you, the build quality on the Sony a7 IV, while I do think it is an improvement over the Mark IIIs, I think that the design and the build quality could both use an improvement in a Mark V. So moving forward, I want to jump back to this tilting touchscreen here. Now, I did not actually do the damage to this touchscreen. It was actually my co-conspirator, Brandon, who actually owned this camera and used it very hard in a lot of different professional settings for quite some time. So I want to send you guys off to him to talk about his experience with the camera, and I think that he'll have some really in-depth insights, especially for you guys out there that are more stills first, in more the commercial portraiture world, the commercial portraiture world. I think that he has a lot of really useful insights and some really cool images he captured with it. So I'm going to throw you over to Minnesota to hear his thoughts on this camera.
All right, thank you, Toby. So I do feel like I have a nuanced perspective on this camera. The big thing that the a7 IV did for me was really get me into hybrid shooting. So before the a7 IV, I did try to do some video. I did it with the a7R III. And I did do a little bit, and it was okay, I guess, but it wasn't really what I wanted out of a camera for video, so I kind of gave up on it. But with the A7 IV, I was able to both keep up with my stills photography and also start doing video. So for stills, I shot a ton of fashion photography, I did commercial portraits, I did some events, and a bunch of product photography. And I did all of these still professionally. And 33 megapixels was kind of a great in-between for all of them. So 33 megapixels is, to me, feels like a great middle ground. It gives you kind of a little bit more than the 24 in terms of resolution, but not the file sizes of like 45. And where I was at with that, at that point, I felt like that was kind of a great in-between. And then the camera was a big upgrade from kind of Sony's past with autofocus. Like this was kind of a next level autofocus system. The eye autofocus was especially great and kind of a really incredible tool for those who are trying to do portrait and or event photography. So I did a bunch of commercial and fashion shoots with it, and the eye autofocus was just a lifesaver. I can't stress how much I feel like eye autofocus has really upped my composition game. One complaint I did have about the camera though was it didn't seem to handle low light as well as I feel like I thought it should. I did this one shoot for a company where I got a bunch of great images at golden hour and sunset, and then I was trying to do a couple more creative images. They weren't really necessary, but I was hoping to get some cool images during blue hour with some sparklers. And those photos just came out a little bit grainy. Not horribly, but enough that it kind of bothered me. And that was one of the photos that they liked, but it just was a little too grainy for what they wanted. So I kind of felt bad about that. But what really pushed me with this camera, or really kind of helped, was this camera was key for me becoming a hybrid shooter. So the first thing that's kind of an in-between for the photo and stills, or the stills and video, is that it had a switch that allowed you to go between video and stills photography, which no other Sony camera before this one had that I can think of. It definitely wasn't on my A7R III, and it wasn't on the A1, which I know a bunch of people were pissed about, but I thought it was such a cool feature to be able to just switch between video and stills, because I did this. Like I would shoot some, I shot a concert and I shot some events where they wanted both video and stills, and I was able to just kind of flip between the two, and it made that possible basically, which I don't know if it would have been possible on my A7R III, or at least not as efficient. 10-bit video was probably the biggest feature for me though. I did shoot some on the R3, the Sony R3, not the Canon R3, just to clarify, where I wasn't really able to color grade the S-Log footage, at least not the way I wanted to, and that kind of pushed me to give up on it, because I didn't really want to just shoot in standard format. I wanted to be able to shoot the cinematic look, and I wasn't able to do that on the A7R III, but once I got the A7 IV with 10-bit video, I was able to really start to color grade my footage. That, with conjunction of S-Log 3 and Sony's S-Log 3, what's the word I'm looking for? Utility LUT, the one that allows you to convert to 709, Rec 709. So that allowed me to create some really cool video with really great color and a cinematic look. 4K 60 was another great feature. I think Sony was maybe just a teeny bit behind when you compare it to the Canon R5, but still a great feature to have. And then another thing is that although it was kind of not a great performer in low light stills, the A7 IV did fantastic in low light video for some reason. I don't know what the difference in like tech was for that or whatever, but in video, I was able to shoot way higher ISO than I thought I'd be able to on it, and it did great. So those were some of the big things that were like pros for the video. There were a couple kind of downsides. I ran into overheating issues. I was shooting a concert and the camera did overheat a few times, which was annoying. That being said, I was able to just kind of turn it off and let it rest for like 10 minutes and use it again. But I had to do this a few times over the course of like a couple-hour concert. And that can be kind of detrimental if you are really trying to capture the whole event, and or if something really important happens during those 10 minutes, you have to let the camera kind of cool down. So that was really annoying and a reason that I don't have it anymore. Another kind of downside was, well, this one's bittersweet, but the 4K 60 is cropped. So a downside if you're trying to shoot wide angle 4K 60, but I guess a way to spin it positive was I was able to get kind of more macro shots, make my macro shots even more macro by using the cropped 4K 60. And that was great for a couple different occasions. The coffee video that we will pop up onto the screen right now is one example of that. So I hope this was helpful. I really felt like it advanced my career into being able to do both video and stills. Definitely didn't take away from most of my stills features. It took a little bit of a downgrade in megapixels, but that can also be swung to be a pro thing also. But otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next video. Back to you, Toby.
Alright guys, it's image quality time. I want to start this segment off by just letting you guys see what this camera is capable of in stills and video. Enjoy. Alright, so it's time to talk about image quality on the Sony a7IV. In my mind, it's really a tale of two mediums with this camera. I kind of feel like the difference between stills and video are sort of completely opposite of each other in the experience you should expect to see with this camera. So in stills, I feel like the image quality leaves a lot to be desired. You did hear Brandon's opinion on it, that the 33 megapixels is really nice. I personally think that the image quality on the a7IV is really essentially no different than any other 24 megapixel sensor out there. The reason for that is this camera has an aliasing filter, and that aliasing filter that goes over the sensor is literally there to blur the image slightly. And because of that, I feel like I don't get that next level crispy image really out of this camera, period. I feel like there's always a little veneer of softness until the image is somewhat sharpened in post. And you know, I also feel like, as I detailed in another video, that the detail in the shadows on this camera, the dynamic range in the shadow areas, is not as good as
other cameras in its price bracket and that I've used in the past either. I'm just a little disappointed all the way around in that regard. Now, that is a completely different story from the actual handling experience when shooting stills with the Sony a7 IV. So in my mind, the Sony a7 IV does a lot to solve the handling issues I've had with previous Sony cameras. The grip is a little bigger and a little beefier. And even though, as I mentioned before, it's not my favorite grip, it's my favorite Sony grip I've personally used. The dial operations, the hybrid shooting experience, the speed with which you're able to switch between stills and video, the customization of the custom buttons, the My Menu mode, the 4 dials, the thumbstick, the touchscreen, the experience of shooting stills on this camera is honestly amazing. Not only is it amazing, but this camera is also super reliable in stills mode. I have never run into any major issues shooting stills, whether that's landscapes on the top of a giant sand dune, or whether that's in the rain, or whether that's at a wedding. You do get 2 card slots. The frames per second is good. I mean, from a stills perspective, this camera is a professional monster in my opinion, and I really love that reliability and user experience. Now, on the other hand, we have video, and in the video department, I find this camera to be significantly more, the word I'm going to use is frustrating. The 7K downsampled 4K off of this sensor is gorgeous. The level of detail and sharpness this camera has without looking digital is shockingly impressive. I absolutely love the way that this image renders out, whether that's on YouTube or whether that's on my computer in my NLE, it doesn't matter. That footage just looks insanely good. And in a funny way, it feels kind of similar to working with actual 8K files, something that I've done quite a bit, and 6K files, like what you could capture with the Lumix S5 IIX and the 8K off of the R5C, which I also shot quite a bit. Now, you can't crop it as much as those cameras. However, at the same time, because it's downsampled, it's a lot cleaner and kind of presents itself really, really well. I adore the 4K off of the Sony a7 IV. It's incredibly gorgeous footage. And in my opinion, not only is it sharper than the FX3, the A7S III, the FX6, and the ZVE1, it also has better low light performance than its higher resolution brethren, which right now is really just made up of the Sony A1 and the A7R5. This camera is in a sweet spot all its own on an image quality side, and it's gorgeous. This is really made really frustrating because of a few reasons. The first reason is this camera overheats, and as Brandon mentioned in his segment, it is a real issue. It is completely unpredictable. What will make it overheat, how long it will need to recover from that overheating. You do get a little warning light that will pop up on the screen before it overheats, but it's unclear at that point how much longer you have. This issue makes shooting professionally with this camera next to impossible, in my opinion. It's the reason why I own the FX30. It's the reason why I'm experimenting with the with the Lumix S5 IIX. This is the key problem, and I am going to mention a couple other cons with the video image quality coming up, but this is the actual one I want you to hear. This camera is not ready for prime time when it comes to video shooting professionally, because you cannot bet the budget of the wedding you're working on or the interview you're shooting that it will maintain and continue filming through the course of that interview, until it runs out of card space or it runs out of battery. And you also can't predict what situations you might be able to get away with it on and what situations you won't. It's just really frustrating. The other two, I would consider them more minor, but still kind of leaning into this situation where the image quality experience is just a little irritating. The usability, the reliability is irritating. Personally, the rolling shutter is a significant issue as well. Personally, I've found that I'm not wanting to whip my camera around like this all the time, so I feel like I get away with it a lot. I just personally think it makes the handheld footage look a little more nauseating and a little harder to get looking right. That may not bother you a ton, but it is something to keep in mind. And the last thing is the crop in 4K 60. Brandon kind of brought out, in my opinion, what is an advantage, that it helps you get closer to your subject. And I don't want to undermine that point. It is really cool that this camera has the functionality to be able to shoot 4K 60 in APS-C mode, something that the Sony a7S III actually doesn't have, and the whole lineup of 12 megapixel sensors that Sony's put out. However, I am going to say that it's probably more beneficial to have 4K full frame. This is something I've kind of gone back and forth on as I've owned the camera and used it in different situations. Sometimes it's literally a non-issue, sometimes it's a benefit, sometimes it's a legitimate problem. It's just something you're going to be working around, as once again, that practical usability from a video perspective. Which kind of leads me to my conclusion on this camera. So I've had it for about a year and a half, and what is kind of my final conclusion with this camera? What are my feelings on it? I've really had to think about this one, because I find myself gravitating towards this camera for a lot of use cases that I wouldn't necessarily expect. And I think that a lot of that just comes down to, I love the way the 24p looks on this camera. For a lot of projects that I use it for, long shoot times aren't that important, and slow motion really isn't that important either. And that's why I think this camera keeps finding itself on my capture clip, and keeps finding itself in my hands, in the field, and continuing to find usage even after I feel like I'm kind of done with the camera because it overheated again or had some other issue. It's just a really great camera to use. And I think this particular point is kind of underrepresented in the photo video community. And the point is knowing how to use the camera and having the camera set up to your desired specifications, where you don't really even have to think about how to change the settings or how to get the most out of it in stills or video, how to shoot hybrid with it. It's really underrated how important it is to know how to use your camera. I know how to take advantage of this camera's strengths, and I largely know how to either predict or work around this camera's weaknesses. And because of that, it just keeps coming with me in my bag to shoots and keeps clicking away photos and video clips for me that, long after I think I should have outgrown this camera. And in that way, I just really appreciate the Sony a7IV. And I think it may be a camera that will be around for much longer, not just because the resale value has been destroyed by the fact that we cracked the back screen and bent the mechanism, but also just because it does fulfill a role that I need in a lot of situations. And for you, if you're looking for a stills video hybrid camera where slow motion isn't super important and long shoot times aren't super important, the Sony a7IV is going to absolutely crush every project you throw at it, in my opinion. And the dual card slots, the battery life, the viewfinder, the touchscreen, the handling, the lens mount, and the unbelievable amount of awesome lenses you can pick for this camera are going to combine to give you an amazing creative experience and enable you to really make some powerful content. All right, well, thank you so much for watching this video. If you guys enjoyed this one, please hit that like button. That actually really helps our channel grow. We are working hard to put out quality content for you guys, both educational and reviewing products to give you guys the power to make the most informed decisions possible in the photo video space and the best content possible in the photo video space. So if that interests you as well, hit that subscribe button. We would love to go along with you on this journey. I did mention earlier that a full walkthrough on this camera is going to be for a different video. And that different video is actually going to be a guide on how to shoot video with Sony cameras. It's going to be a guide that I hope kind of pulls together both beginner shooters, but also can offer people more advanced who have maybe been shooting Sony for a long time or have been shooting a different brand, the information that they need to take a Sony camera and get going with it. I'm specifically going to be focusing on Sony's modern camera designs, so the Sony a7IV design-ish, a7R5 design, and the FX30 design. But even if you have one of Sony's older cameras like the a7 III, I'm going to be kind of giving some tips and tricks for using those older ones as well. So if that interests you, that's another reason to stay tuned to our channel in the future, and I will see you on the next adventure.